All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Want to welcome all of you to our Beyond Compliance webinar series. We're excited to have you back this month for what's going to be a very popular topic as demonstrated by the interest this month. So we're really excited to have our guest presenter, Rod Wheeler, who I will introduce here in just a moment. This month's topic is bridging the gap between FSMA and food defense, and we'll talk a little bit more about what to expect there. Speaking of what to expect, for those of you that are new to the series, welcome. We're excited to have you. Many of you may be familiar with the series that we've been running for, gosh, over 5 years now, the FSMA Friday series. And we got a lot of really great response from that, but we're also, people are looking for more training, more tactical takeaways, and that's what this whole Beyond Compliance series is all about. So this is a monthly educational series where we are lucky enough to bring in some of the top industry thought leaders and experts like we have with Rod here today, practitioners that are in the trenches with all of you. And the idea is to kind of share, what's working for them, what are some best practices and trends and strategies, and the goal is that you walk away with some things you can really implement into your own practices and businesses. So we really do design these for you. We welcome you to share ideas that you would love to hear more about, topics, presenters even that you would like to hear from, and we'll certainly try and work that into our series, but we hope to see you keep coming back for more. For those of you that may not be familiar with us over at Safety Chain, as you can imagine, these take a lot of time, effort, and resources, but we are extremely proud to present this and sponsor the whole series. We are cloud-based food quality management system, so we have modules for food safety, food quality, and supplier compliance with the idea of helping you save time and create a little more efficiency around all these programs you're running day to day. So we would love to hear more about any initiatives you may have coming up in the coming year, and check us out at safetychain.com. We've got some pretty exciting things going on, and we'd love to share a little bit more with you when we have some time. As we get started here, just a couple of things to help you as we try and pack as much as we can into this short time we have together. One is our format's informal but professional. So this is a very serious topic today. We like to think that we don't take ourselves that seriously, so we try and have more of a conversational tone, so we encourage you to engage, ask questions. The idea we had when we put this together is how would we talk and what would we talk about if we were all hanging out at an industry event, and that's kind of our approach here, and we hope you enjoy that style. So we encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A box. So on the right-hand side of your panel there, you'll see a little button for Q&A, has a little question mark box. That's a great way to send us the questions. I'll be monitoring those, and we'll have a Q&A session, timer permitting at the end. I know there's going to be a lot of questions, and we encourage you to send those over, and I wanted to let you know up front that Rod has graciously offered to take anything offline that we're unable to cover today. So rest assured, if we don't get to you, hang in there. We'll definitely make sure that we get his expertise and get your answers to all your questions there. You'll also notice that only the panelists are displayed, so you'll see myself and Rod, as well as Jen from our team. So we'll be monitoring all these questions and everything on the back end, including any of the technical or audio issues that you may have. We will also be recording the session, so probably the most common question we get is, can we get a copy of the slides? And Rod has, again, been gracious enough to allow us to share those with you. So we will send those along with his contact info after the webinar within a day or two. So you have everything at your fingertips, including a link to the replay in case you want to check that out or share it with some friends and colleagues. Last but not least, this is a webinar, and they could potentially have an audio issue. I know nobody's ever had that before, but if you do, we'll try and do our best on the back end, so shoot us a little note. If not, a couple of common fixes are just to switch your audio option. You can choose either the web or the phone-based option. The other magical thing that usually happens with all of our computers, typically, if you log out and log back in, sometimes that does the trick as well. So if you get stuck, shoot us a note, and we'll do our best to help you out. But we're really pleased to have you all here today. And I want to get out of the way because we have got a ton of great content from our guest speaker today, Rod Wheeler from the Global Food Defense Institute. And I've asked to give a little bit of an introduction. We had so much interest in this topic, and I was giving Rod a hard time that I think he's got quite the following around, and then you read his bio and now you know why. So let me tell you a little bit about Rod. Homeland Security and Global Food Defense and Law Enforcement expert. Rod Wheeler is the founder and CEO of the Global Food Defense Institute, which provides educational training and certification programs for the food, agricultural, and chemical industries to ensure confidence and protection to guard against intentional contamination or sabotage. He's also a former all-star homicide detective with the Metropolitan Police Department of Washington, D.C., as well as an investigator for the state Ohio Attorney General. Rod has made over 1,000 television appearances as a law enforcement and security expert and is a crime analyst for the Fox News Channel and is seen regularly on ABC's Good Morning America, 48 Hours, as well as several other national news shows. So Rod, you are a rock star. I knew it, and we are so pleased to have you. In fact, pretty timely. We were trying to track you down last week, and you were using some of those investigative skills, if I recall. So thanks for being here. We're really excited to have you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Brian, for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to spend time with industry folk and talk about ways that we can help help our military and our law enforcement and everyone else keep our nation safe, and specifically the food and agricultural industry safe. As Brian alluded to last week, folks, I'll just kind of start out by sharing with you all. I was brought into an investigation, or asked to conduct an investigation of a couple of trailer loads of food product that were stolen off of a lot. And we've seen somewhat of a slight increase in this type of theft. So I know all of us on the call work in the food industry in some capacity. So that's something that you want to definitely keep in mind. Just right out of the box here, make some notes pertaining to that, because we're seeing an increase, like I said, of truckloads of food products stolen off of lots. So just keep that in mind as we go forward. Now, there's going to be a number of things that I'm going to cover within this short period of time. Many of you all have heard me speak before, so I can be very practical and share experiences and things that I can share with you pertaining to things that I see as I travel about within the country and even outside of the country. But this topic is really a timely topic, and I'll tell you, when I was approached by Brian back at the SQF conference to speak on this topic, I was really impressed and excited, because I'll tell you what a lot of folks have been saying to me over the past year. They've been saying, you know, Rod, with FSMA and complying with FSMA and understanding the key activity types and understanding this, they said it's a bit much. And we're really confused, and we don't know where to begin, where to start. And so what my goal is with this webinar is to try to help bridge the gap between the Food Safety Modernization Act and food defense. You know, what's the difference between the goal of what we're trying to achieve and then identifying and responding to the risk that we see? So that's what my goal is to do with this webinar. As we know, everything that I'm talking about, we'll be talking about, and everything that we've been talking about, and the result of FSMA and everything else, is the result of 9/11. You know, the world changed 9/11, folks. The question and the challenge for all of us on the call today is, how have we changed since 9/11? Now, do we do business the same way we've always done business prior to 9/11, or do we have to take some responsibility and assist our military and our first responders in keeping our nation and our food supply safe? And the answer to that is yes. We do have to take a responsibility, and that's why I applaud our agency folks at the FDA and the USDA for even, you know, taking the initiative, helping us with guidance documents and things like that in the food industry, giving us great advice and direction, things we can do to keep that wannabe bad guy, that wannabe terrorist out of our food supply and out of our facilities. So I just want to start out by sharing with you all, back in September of last year, 2017, you all may have seen this. Newsweek published an interesting article where they talked about ISIS had supposedly called for the poisoning of food in grocery stores across the United States and Europe. Now, my law enforcement contacts in Washington, D.C. has told me that they have been unable to substantiate this threat. So they don't know or they don't believe it's a credible threat, which is a good thing. However, that means to us we cannot ignore it, because obviously there's some propaganda, there's some discussion out there among some of these either terrorist groups or wannabe terrorist individuals to contaminate our food supply. So they're thinking about it. And so we know that, we understand that. So what do? There's a lot of things that we can do to better protect our food supply. Just to kind of go along as an introduction here, back in November, some of you all may remember this guy. This is what I like to call the new face of terrorism today. This is the guy that rented a truck in New York City. He rented a U-Haul truck, then he mowed down 5 or 6 people, I believe, along the Hudson River there, killing them. What's interesting about this, folks, and this is really some interesting stuff here, what's interesting is the fact that the day that this happened in New York City, I was actually in Syracuse, New York, conducting a security vulnerability assessment at a food plant, right? One of the things I look for when I do security vulnerability assessments is whether or not keys are left in the ignition of unoccupied vehicles on the lot of the food facility. Well, this particular day when this situation happened, guess what? 5 trucks, box truck vehicles were left in the ignition of the trucks parked on the lot at this food facility. And so basically what I'm saying is that this guy could have easily went to that food facility, jumped in one of their box trucks, and drove 82 miles south to 42nd and Broadway, and look at the amount of people he would have been able to harm. So again, that's a vulnerability. So we have to be cognizant of that and make sure, matter of fact, this is the actual picture you can see there on the left-hand side of your, maybe on the right-hand side of your screen, where I took a picture that day. This is the same day that thing happened in New York City, that situation. This is one of the trucks that was parked on the lot, and you can see there, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but you see the keys in the ignition. Again, this is the same type of box truck that was used over in Nice, France, when that guy killed 84 people. So things like that, folks, we want to be very cognizant and aware of. Now, moving right along, I went to do a vulnerability assessment at this one plant in Fresno, California. And when you walk into the lobby of the facility of this food plant, they had this banner hanging on the ceiling of the facility, and it said, "We proudly serve over 2 million consumers daily." That's a great thing, right? This is an American success story. Here's my question for all of you all on the webinar today. What would your banner read? If this banner was in your lobby, what would it say? Would it say, "We proudly serve over 2 million? Probably a lot more than that daily. That's a good thing, and congratulations on that. However, what does this banner mean to the 2 individual faces that you see there? If you said this means to them, and as we know, that's the Sarnea brothers, that's the face of terrorism today. What it means to them is that, or somebody with their mindset, is that this is the place to potentially hit. We look at how many people we can harm if we can get into this food processing facility. So that's kind of how you have to look at things as well. Know this about terrorism. The terrorists will first select or identify a vulnerable soft target. The terrorists will determine or try to determine the method of attack that they're going to use. How difficult is it to get into your facility? Do you know who all of the contractors are? Not the contracting companies. I'm talking specifically the individuals that work for these contracting companies. What about some of your vendors, such as your pest control representatives or uniform or vending machine representatives? How much access do they have to critical areas of your plant? The terrorists or the wannabe terrorists will try to then conduct a detailed surveillance of your facility, and then they're going to look at the security measures that you currently have in place. They will assess the vulnerability of your facility, and then they're either going to select your site or they're going to move to a softer target. After site selection, they're going to do a second round of surveillance, and then finally, they will schedule the attack to be conducted. That's how they operate. Now, who are the people that can cause us harm? Obviously, criminals, protesters, terrorist groups, subversives, rogue or disgruntled insiders. Now, a subversive is a person who would compromise their values and beliefs for a benefit. And that's a huge concern, believe it or not, with a lot of our military people. They're concerned about subversives even trying to get something into the food supply that we, put in our commissaries for our military representatives. So that's what subversive is, a person who would compromise their values and beliefs for a benefit. Typically, what would that benefit be? Well, if you said money, you're probably right. So just keep that in mind as well. But I'm going to give you some strategies in a moment as to what we can do to mitigate some of these risks and at the same time, keep your facility safe and comply with the Food Safety Modernization Act. Awareness is key, folks. I can't stress this enough. Many of you all have heard me speak before, and I've said it before, and I'll continue to say it. Awareness is key. Your frontline workers are your greatest asset. I think I'm going to probably say that 30 times on this webinar today. Prevention, safeguards, having safeguards in place, being prepared, having a plan in place, being able to respond, and then ultimately recovery, getting back into business. The basic tenets of terrorism are these. Terrorists strike when and where least expected. Terrorists will strike soft targets. They're going to look for a target. Okay, they're going to come to your facility. They're going to sit outside. And you know what? We only have an hour in this webinar, but I could give you story after story where we've seen situations before that were suspicious. We don't know, in fact, if it was an act of terrorism or some terrorist group or some individual who want to be a terrorist, checking out a place, scoping out a location. But I could give you examples of that. Matter of fact, one just happened over this past December. I was notified about a situation that happened at one food plant in Nashville, Tennessee, and the QA manager who had been in one of my food defense courses went out and confronted this individual that was taking pictures, step one of a terrorist attack, of her facility. The guy did not want to give her any information. She called the Nashville Police Department. They came out. The guy did not have any ID on him. He gave them a name, but that's the last they heard of this. So they don't know why this guy was taking pictures of their facility, but that's something that remains to be found out. So the question of the day for all of us on the call is, how many consumers, think about this collectively with all of us on the call, will come in contact with a product or an ingredient over the next 30 days from one of our facilities? Excellent question. That's something that we have to think about. Now, contaminated food in the United States is estimated to be responsible for approximately 48 million illnesses, 128,000 hospitalizations, and 3,000 deaths, costing the nation more than $14 billion a year in terms of medical care, lost productivity, chronic health problems, and deaths. That's according to the CDC. Look at those numbers for a second, folks. Those are huge numbers. That's contaminated food. Now, that's not necessarily intentionally contaminated food. Most of these, I'd say, or I'd suspect, are unintentional, but nonetheless contaminated foods. Violent extremists and terrorist groups consider America's agriculture and food production tempting targets. Now, this comes directly from the Department of Homeland Security. Tempting targets. You might want to jot that down. Our food and ag industry is a target for, we know, violent extremists and terrorist groups. They have indicated an interest before in terms of harming our food supply. So let's kind of segue now, now that we have that brief history of terrorism and understanding it, a little bit more into what I mean by goal-based food defense. And this is really some really good information here, so take some good notes, folks. Matter of fact, I gave this similar presentation last week, and the folks really appreciated it because they say they have a better understanding now as to what it means to comply with FSMA, but at the same time keeping their people, products, assets, and brand protected. Now, when we talk about, I call this the food defense preparedness and response continuum, right? So the first thing is we have our pre-event state. What's the goal? Ask yourself the question, what is the goal when it comes to food defense at our facility? And I'm going to ask each of you all that question now on this webinar. What is the goal with food defense? Is it just to check some boxes so that we can say, oh, we comply with FSMA? Or is it that at 4 o'clock in the evening when you go home, or 5 in the evening, you can go home rest assured that your products, your people, and your facility and your assets and your brand are as safe as possible? So we have the pre-event state, and you see that there. And so where you see FDP, that's for your food defense plan. And that's why it's critical, folks, that you write a food defense plan. But before you even write your plan, or part of writing your plan, is to conduct a vulnerability assessment. Every facility, and to comply with FSMA, needs to have conducted a site-specific vulnerability assessment. Now, let me just put a period there for a second, because here's a question a lot of people always ask me in the food industry. We have 14 facilities, Rod. Does each facility need to have a vulnerability assessment? Or can we just do one assessment at one facility or one location and use it for all? The answer is no. You cannot do it that way. Every facility has its own unique vulnerabilities. Even if it's the same company, even if you're processing the same type of products, your vulnerabilities are going to be different. Why? Because for one, it's in a different area, so you're going to have different types of issues depending upon the area that you're located in. So every facility needs to have a site-specific vulnerability assessment. When you do your assessment, assess the threats and opportunities. Develop protective measures and or mitigation strategies. Mitigation strategies, you know, a lot of people look at that and they look at the FDA's website where, by the way, you can get a lot of information about the various mitigation strategies that you can use, but to some people it's very confusing, and I can understand why. Use good common sense when you look at those mitigation strategies, and I'll give you some examples in a moment. Prioritize protective strategies. Implement protective measures. Plan and train all of your staff on food defense, okay? Now, this is pre-event. So now we have the tampering event. You see that there in the middle. So now what should happen? Now your response plan to that tampering event should take place. Now, your response plan, folks, is actually a component of your food defense plan. Listen closely, because this makes so much sense. Your response plan is a component of your food defense plan. That's the whole purpose of writing the food defense plan, so that in the event of a tampering event or any other type of event as well, you will be able to respond. So under your response plan, you're going to assemble your crisis response team. Your team members for your crisis team should be listed in your food defense plan, okay? Now, some companies call it the food defense team. Some companies call it your crisis response team. It doesn't matter what you call it. Okay, these are the people that already know in advance, write that down and underline that, in advance what the responsibilities are going to be in the event of a crisis. Again, that crisis could be a tampering event, it could be an active shooter event at your facility, it could be anything. Implement your response plans, monitor your business components, assess your response capability, and remember, the goal is to try to contain the impact or the effect of whatever the tampering event is. Implement your mitigation strategies. Remember, we developed the mitigation strategies under the food defense plan. Remember, your mitigation strategies was developed right after you did your vulnerability assessment, because you do them hand in hand. So that's under your food defense plan. Then you want to look at recovery and then returning back to normalcy. Now, you'll notice the question mark that I have next to contain the impact and the effect, implement mitigation, and then you have the arrow going over here, back over here, to assess the threats and opportunities. So that's what I'm talking about when I say that your mitigation strategies are actually going to be built into the food defense plan, so that when an event does take place, you'll be better able to respond, and that's going to be identified in your response plan. Then you have the post-event state, after the event, and that should take us, if we do everything correctly, that should take us back to the pre-event state. So my question is, why not just work to get there now? That is the purpose of the facility response plan concept. Now, I know I went through that kind of quickly, and hopefully you understood what I was saying there, but basically I'm explaining the reason why it's important and critical for you to have the food defense plan and how your mitigation strategies actually can be utilized as your response plan in the event of a tampering event. So let me ask you all this question, to everyone on the call today. Is the goal of food defense different from food safety? This is a good question. Is the goal of food defense different than food safety? Now, if you said the answer is yes, then you're incorrect. The goal for food defense and food safety are the same. Why do I say that? And that's protecting our food supply and our people, our assets, and our brand. Now, we mean protecting the food supply regardless if it's intentional or unintentional, and that's why the goals are the same. Now, risk-based assessments focuses on identifying risk, but not security processes or solutions, okay? Risk-based assessments focuses on identifying risk, but not security processes or solutions. Significantly fewer risks will be identified if good security measures are already in place. So let me give you a couple of quick examples as to what I mean by this. Just this morning, I was teaching a food defense course, and I threw out some examples to the folks, and they really liked the example. So let's say I talk a lot about removing keys from the vehicles parked on your lot that are unoccupied. Now, what's the goal? The goal is to make sure that the vehicles are not used by anybody with ill intent and someone that's not authorized. That's the goal, right? So protecting the safety, security of the vehicles and the products that may be in the vehicle. So we remove the keys. The risk, however, is when we have keys left in the vehicle, it increases the risk. But if we have a good security plan in place in the beginning, which requires keys not being left in the vehicles, then your risk is going to be reduced automatically. And hopefully that made sense. Another example is locking doors. The goal is to keep certain doors locked at our food facilities to keep someone from entering into these critical areas or key activity type areas, putting some type of a contaminant over into the product. That's the goal. So how do we achieve that goal? There's a few things that we can do. And actually, these were a few things that the group this morning pointed out, and I thought it was excellent. You obviously want to make sure that you can monitor who goes in and out of those areas. You want to have very good locks and other security measures on those areas, right? And you also want to be able to respond and validate to make sure that the security measures that you have in place are adequate for whatever the risk that has been identified is. Goal-based assessments, you understand the purpose of what's the goal? What is it that we're trying to achieve? Establish appropriate goals to achieve the purpose. Define the goals, not the method to achieve them. That's important, folks. Define the goals. Now we're talking about, bridging that gap between food defense and FSMA, okay? Define what it is that we're trying to achieve, okay? So when you're writing your food defense plan or even doing your vulnerability assessment, your first stop or your first step isn't to go and to look at mitigation strategies. Your first step is to identify what is it that we're trying to achieve. So define what needs to be demonstrated to ensure that the goals are achieved. Goal-based food defense. Meeting the goals is less subjective than risk-based food defense or risk-based assessments and more objective in nature. The other advantage, I think, to goal-based food defense is that you can get quantifiable results, okay? In other words, you know what it is that we're trying to achieve, so now we can actually develop benchmarks and measurements in terms of whether or not we've been able to achieve these goals. Now, that serves two purposes. One, it gives you a clear picture as to whether or not the mitigation strategies that you're utilizing in these particular areas is working. And two, it also complies with FSMA, because FSMA, the intentional adulteration rule, makes it clear that you need to be able to validate and demonstrate that what you are doing is in fact working. Very, very important. So what is it that we are trying to protect? Is it our brand, our products, people, our assets? It's all of those things. Brand protection is important. Ask yourself what credible threats or other dangers could occur at our facility to our people, our assets, and our brand. Now, I talk a lot about terrorism and crime, but at the same time, what about natural events? You can't forget about that, and that's another area that I think we need to bridge and help people understand, is that when we talk about food defense, it's not just about the food products. It's about facility protection. It's about keeping our people safe. It's about keeping our assets and our brand name safe from intentional harm. So in order to do that, we have to look at various types of threats that could occur. Natural threats, weather-related threats, criminal, accidental, and then, of course, terroristic-related threats. Here's a good question you want to ask yourself. What is the relative likelihood of occurrence for each of the threats that we've identified? Okay? Probability should be measured based on the effectiveness of the barriers in place, not based on experience. Now, what does that mean? And that's why I put that particular picture there. Matter of fact, I just took this picture at a plant maybe about 2 weeks ago. The goal is to keep chemicals and things of that nature secure from outsiders or people that may have access to the plant from using these things with ill intent. That's the goal. So they build this cage. The problem is what? When you look at this picture, what is the issue here? They have the nice cage. They have chemicals and other ingredients behind the cage, inside the cage, but what's the problem? The door is open. So they have not achieved their goal. And then the reason they said is because the reason that the door is open, it's not supposed to be open, as you can see there, that cage on the door in the cage, but they said nothing has ever happened. So based on their experience, they're saying we're safe. But now, if something were to happen, they're saying, then maybe we'll start locking the cage. But isn't that after the fact? So you have the cage there, so your intent is good behind achieving the goal, but you haven't achieved the goal because you still have the risk of someone going in the cage. So that's why they need to put a lock on that cage. That's just another good example of what we mean by that. But what should be done now and in the future, before and during a situation or an event, to protect your people, your products, and to ensure that your products are safe and secure? When do you do these things? Do you do it now, or do you wait until after something happens? Here's another excellent question, and I posed this question, I'll share with you all, to a security director of a major company last week. I asked him, I said, how much security is enough security? And I really liked her response, and I'll tell you what she said in a moment. But that's a question that I'm asked pretty often. Rod, how much security is enough security? Do we need barbed wire? Do we need razor wire? Do we need all these various cameras and things of that nature? Here's what her response was to me when I asked her, how much security is enough security? She said, security, your level of security should be commensurate with the risk, okay? And I'll repeat that so you can write it down, because this is important, folks. Your level of security should be commensurate with the risk, okay? So, for example, if I were to put a picture of a warehouse up on the screen right now, and there's no fence or no gate around the warehouse, and I were to ask you, how much security would you use at this warehouse? Your first question to me should be what? If you said, you would ask me, what are we trying to protect, then you're right. Because whatever security measures you use at that warehouse It's going to depend on what it is that we're trying to protect. Okay, now we're really getting into the nuts and bolts of bridging FSMA with reality food defense. What is it that we're trying to protect? If I were to say to you, there's nothing in that warehouse, it's completely empty, nothing's in there, then obviously you won't need, security guards. You may want to have a security guard, and I know most of you will have an unlimited budget anyway, so you'll probably have security guards. You'll have a high-tech system, card access system. You don't need those kind of things if there's nothing in that warehouse. But if I were to tell you folks that that warehouse contains ready-to-eat food products and bulk ingredients, that changes everything. Now your level of security is going to increase. Now you are going to need cameras. Now you are going to need a good card access system. But again, your vulnerability assessment should identify these things for you. So number one, the goal is to facilitate movement of people in the facility. Control of people in and around the facility. This includes employees, contractors, temporary workers, service personnel, truck drivers. Now, can I share this with you real quick? That's another huge vulnerability, folks, that I've been seeing for some reason lately. A lot of individuals that don't work for the actual company, truck drivers, independent drivers, just moseying around the inside of our food facilities, that's just not good. You got to have better control of where these people go in your facility, because I'll tell you, that's who's going to probably harm you and probably try to harm the product, somebody that you don't know that well. Every access door, emergency exit, egress door, overhead door, window, vent opening should be controlled to deter unauthorized, undetected entry. What do I mean by that? You need to make sure that your perimeter doors are secure, and not only secure, they should be alarmed, especially those doors that you don't use for daily entry and exit. Okay, very important. I had a plant manager call me just last week, and he said, over the weekend, Rod, someone went out of one of our doors that has an alarm on it. And when he got to work on Monday morning, excuse me, he noticed that the alarm was ringing, but he was never able to determine who it was that went in and out of this particular door. What do you think my question to him is, and what do you think could potentially be going on? Well, my first question to him is, do you have a record of everyone that was in that building over the weekend? And you know what his response was? For the most part, we do. But he said there are occasions when people will come and drop off food, they'll walk through the facility, they'll ask to use our restroom, and we let them in. Well, that's the problem right there, and then that's the vulnerability. So again, it goes back to our goal of, that defeats our first goal. Our first goal is to facilitate the movement of people. That means accountability, folks, of everybody in your plant. There should never be a time, this is good information, write this down, there should never be a time when you cannot say exactly who was in your facility and the time in which they were in your facility. And to comply with FSMA, management should be able to demonstrate that whatever measures you have are indeed working, that you have in place. You have to do that now to comply with FSMA. That's very important. The goal, number two, background and reference checks. The goal of background and reference checks is to ensure that the backgrounds of persons who will be allowed unescorted access inside the plant has been properly vetted, right? Background checks may include verifying information on the employment application, former addresses, former employment. Be sure your background checks complies with local laws. Now, here's a question someone just asked me this morning right before the webinar, and I want to see if have you ever thought about this? A guy said to me, he said, what if I have an employee that's been working here for 2 years, and let's say that employee gets into some kind of trouble during a particular weekend, not while he's at work, but while he's employed by the company. He said, would I be held accountable, meaning the company, if we don't do anything about that because we did not know about that? So in essence, what this manager was asking me is whether or not they should continue to do like continual or a background check on an annual basis of all of their employees? Now, I don't know the answer to that question, and I'll tell you why. Because it varies by company. Some companies, they do an annual background check once a year on all of their employees to try to find out whether or not, they've gotten into any trouble while they've been employed at the company, and then other companies don't. But that's just something that you have to think about, and make sure whatever you do, you guide it by your company policy. Goal number 3, site-specific vulnerability assessment, okay? The goal is to ensure that facility vulnerabilities are identified and mitigated. To achieve this important goal, you must have a site-specific vulnerability assessment conducted. Identify areas which will require additional security measures or solutions. Be especially mindful of the 4 key activity types, which I'm about to talk about in a minute. The facility management should be able to demonstrate the effectiveness of these measures or mitigation strategies, okay? Site-specific vulnerability assessment. Now, my recommendation, and many of you all on the call have heard me say this before, my recommendation is that your first vulnerability assessment at least should be done by someone on the outside, okay? In other words, I would bring in a consultant, and it could be anyone. I mean, there's a number of organizations now that do vulnerability assessments, but let me just give you a quick side note with this, because, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but there's another issue I've been noticing in the food industry over the past year as a result of FSMA becoming a law now. You have a lot of people doing vulnerability assessments, but let me share this 2 things with you all, folks. You're going to really like this, okay? Number 1, if anybody from the outside comes in to do a vulnerability assessment at your plant, make sure they do part of the assessment at night. That's right, you heard correctly, at night or under the cover of darkness. Why? There's a whole host of vulnerabilities that you identify at night that you don't see during the day. And the problem I have with some of these folks doing assessments is they come to do the assessment at 9 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon, all during the day. Then make sure that whoever does your assessment does part of the assessment on a weekend, especially if your plant operates on the weekend. You may say, well, why is that important? Again, there's a whole host of vulnerabilities that's identified on the weekend. We don't have a lot of time here, but about a month ago, I did a vulnerability assessment at this one plant up in Seattle, Washington. And they operate 7 days a week, but my assessment was scheduled for a Monday, but I got there on a Sunday afternoon. Now check this out, folks. I got there on a Sunday afternoon at about 5 o'clock, right? There was a roll-up door at the plant. I just was going to go by the plant to see where it was located. The roll-up door was wide open. I didn't see anybody walking around there, right? Now, they do operate 7 days a week, but very few people that are there on a Sunday. But the roll-up door was open. Okay, so I thought, well, maybe it's a maintenance guy or somebody's in there working. So I went ahead, I went to dinner. Well, on my way back from dinner, back to my hotel, I decided to drive past the plant again. That same roll-up door was open, right? So I said, now that's a little strange. Let me go take a look. Now, see, this is why I'm saying you need to do a vulnerability assessment on the weekend. I walk into the plant. You're not going to believe this. Would you believe 2 individuals had broken into the plant? Had broken into the plant that day. They were still in the facility when I just happened to walk in. The employees that were supposed to be there had left, and they left that roll-up door open. Needless to say, because of my background as a cop, I knew how to take them out. But actually, all I did, I called the police there, and we were in Seattle. But the point is, that's why it's important assessments, part of your assessment on a weekend, because I can tell you we don't have a lot of time, but maybe I'll come back for another webinar. There's a lot of vulnerabilities that's identified on the weekend and at night that you will not notice during the week. Trust me when I tell you this. I've been doing this a long time. Okay, now real quickly, key activity types, right? What's the goal? We know what our 4 key activity types are. The reason that I'm harping on key activity types, folks, is because the FDA, I think, for very good reason, talks about key activity types. I think the FDA is spot on with this one. They talk about making sure our security measures and mitigation strategies are definitely in place for these key activity types. I do investigations, and I'll tell you, out of all of the investigations I've done over the past 10 years in food plants, it's typically been tampering in the key activity type areas. That's why the FDA has focused, and a lot of people have been asking, why is the FDA harping on these key activity types? There's reasons, a good reason. So these are the areas where you definitely want to make sure you have good security measures in. Liquid storage and handling, same thing. So I can give you case after case, story after story. Somebody's tampering with the liquid tank. I just learned something new yesterday that you could do with some of the ports leading into some of these liquid tanks. I mean, it's just unbelievable. But certain security measures definitely need to be in place there. Secondary ingredient handling, such as staging areas, preparation areas, rework areas. If you're getting product back in for rework, folks, please write this down. You need to keep that product separate from new products, okay? Rework should not be commingled at all. And the only reason I'm emphasizing this is because during a couple of my vulnerability assessments, I've seen this recently, where rework product is kind of mixed in with new product. That's just not good, and I don't think the FDA would stand for that. And so that's why your security measures need to be consistent, and they need to be strong and enforced around secondary ingredient areas, staging areas, and rework areas. And then the last type, and this is the most profound, I think, is mixing rooms and blending rooms, homogenizing rooms. If somebody's going to tamper with your product, I would say it's going to be one of these 4 key activity types, but I would also say 9 times out of 10, it's going to be right here, mixing rooms. Again, I know we don't have a lot of time. I just investigated a case this past summer, last year, where, let me tell you what this guy was doing. He was, some of us in some of our food plants, we wear earplugs, right? Well, some of the earplugs have this really tiny little piece of metal all the way up in the earplug, right? This guy was taking the metal pieces out, throwing them over into the finished product. Now, obviously, the foreign object detectors, the metal detectors picked up on this, but just because it picked up on it doesn't mean you ignore it, because it happened 4 times, 4 different times. If that's the case, right, you have a problem, a problem person working that line or somewhere in that area. So if I come out to do the investigation, when I say anybody, law enforcement, security, food defense experts, they're going to ask you this question: do you have cameras in that particular area? Then they're going to ask you, which I always ask, is that area a restricted area? What do you mean by that, Rod? I mean, is that the type of area that you would limit to access to only those people that are authorized to be in that area? That's a key activity type. And if it's not, it should be. Access to any of these 4 key activity types should be restricted. I like to call them red zones. And maybe on the next webinar, I'll explain to you what I mean by these red zones. We need to have more red zones in food facilities. It's a very economical way of ramping up security. You don't have to spend a lot of money, but these are now red zones, and it means something. And some of my clients have been converting these key activity types to these red zones, and it's been working great, and it doesn't cost them a lot of money. So that's a good thing, but I'll talk more about that on another webinar. Number 4, investigate and mitigate any security breaches. The goal is to identify, report, and mitigate security breaches, or even suspected security breaches. But remember, to comply with FSMA, facility management should be able to demonstrate the effectiveness of the security measures or mitigation strategies. And number 5, develop plans, policies, and procedures, right? And this should include training all personnel. It was what I call the See Something, Do Something frontline awareness course, right? Your frontline workers are key, folks. Can't stress it enough. Train your personnel on food defense, protecting products, people, and assets from intentional harm and individual security responsibilities. So as I conclude with these last 5 slides, let me give you 5 things to do now to achieve and improve your goal-based food defense posture. Number 1, build a culture of food defense within your organization from top to bottom. This includes suppliers, right? We didn't talk much about suppliers on this webinar. Your suppliers need to comply with FSMA as well, and the regulations of FSMA in order for you to comply. So, you know, with FSMA, it's the entire chain now. It used to be one step forward, one step back with the Bioterrorism Act, but now with FSMA, even your suppliers need to show evidence, demonstrable evidence that they have certain food defense procedures in place. Immediately conduct a site-specific vulnerability assessment. Now, folks, there's no formula or recipe for conducting the assessment. I do have a software that I use. You know, I'm not here to sell anything. It's available. If you want it, just contact me. But listen, use common sense when you do your vulnerability assessment. You can, a lot of people already know what their vulnerabilities are, believe it or not. So use common sense. Improve alert and warning systems. Use intelligence when deciding where to place your cameras. Don't forget about your KATs. Your KATs are your key activity types, right? And here's why I put that there really quickly, is because if you had a limited budget, and let's say you were to say, Rod, I only have 32 cameras. I can tell you where to put those cameras. You may not need 200 cameras, right? If you have 32 cameras and that's all you got this year, and maybe you can add on as time goes by, I can tell you exactly where to place those cameras in your facility. So know where to place the cameras, but don't forget about your key activity type areas, because those are key. Improve information sharing with your local first responders and your members of management. You know, when we do active shooter training now for employees, every time I do this training for a company, I bring in the local police department and typically the state police to assist with the active shooter training. And I do that for two reasons, folks. One is to improve not only information sharing about what to do in an active shooter situation, but in general, it really makes a difference. And I'm not just saying this because of my background as a cop, but it really makes a difference when you have a very good working relationship with your first responders. And if you need help in setting up that relationship, I can definitely help you with that. I've done it with companies. I've put it with folks I know. Very good network of law enforcement folks across the country. But that's critical. And then last but not least, don't just say something, do something. Your frontline workers are your greatest asset. Make sure they have the training and they know what to do and how to respond. I know I kind of blew through some of the slides pretty quickly because we are limited on time. As you know, sometimes when I get to talking on some of these webinars and the time runs out, but I wanted to make sure I shared a lot of that information with you. Again, I appreciate Safety Chain for taking the lead and recognizing that this is a major critical thing that, you know, they can assist the food companies with, and hopefully you guys were able to get something out of this. This slide just shows you some of the services that I offer at the food. We're a small company, by the way, at the Food Defense Institute. But let me ask you, Brian, are there any questions that I can answer in the time remaining?
Yeah, well, first, thank you. That was a massive amount of content. I got tons of notes. We do have some questions, but I just want to thank you. We have a lot of folks we do these types of things with, Rod, and you had a ton of actionable stuff, which is what the audience is always looking for. So I think the good news for everybody is we do have the slides, which we will share. Rod, one early question that came in was about, do you have some links? I know you have a great website, but there was a specific question about links for insider threat reducing activities. Do you have any resources or links around that, or anything else you want to share with the audience?
Not particularly for insider threat reducing activities. Obviously, in some of my material that I use in our two-day food defense certification course, we specifically talk about insider threats. And there's some information that I've been able to gather over the years from government agencies, which specifically talks about insider threats, and I'm always willing to share that information with folks. And just keep this in mind too, Brian, and this is so important. When I say share information, I don't always mean to charge people for it, and I don't. You know what's more important to me? That we all work together when it comes to food defense and homeland security and keeping our nation safe. Hey, we'll worry about what it costs later, but right now, let's just make sure we ramp up security at our facilities and get everything safe.
We appreciate that, and that's why we wanted to have you here today. We know that's the kind of integrity you have. You mentioned SQF. There's a question around the folks, we have a lot of people on here, I'm sure they're in a similar boat around SQF Level 3 or Edition 8. Can you talk about any changes specifically in food defense as it goes with some of those changes that have just come out?
Yes, I can, because the FMI, which obviously owns SQF, I've been consulting with them over the past couple of years specifically on food defense. And a lot of the regulation, or some of the regulations from FSMA are now a part of the SQF audit when it comes to intentional adulteration. Again, I have put together sort of like a white paper with all of the audit schemes, but just the food defense aspects of the audit schemes. And if you wanted to give my email address out, I'd be more than happy to email it to you free of charge.
Yeah.
So just shoot me an email, tell me what you need, and I'll send it right back to you. Okay.
Great. Well, really appreciate that. So for those that were asking that question, Rod's email is on there. We'll also include it in the follow-up. Got one more question that snuck in here, Rod, as we wrap up. Question is, what triggers should cause a reanalysis of an employee, whether he or she is a threat, and can you do something once you discover an erratic employee? These are very sensitive but important questions for sure.
Yeah, no, those are excellent questions. Again, there are things that you can look for. I like to call these things warning signs, folks. And again, not just for food defense, but for other types of activities too. There are triggers, there are things that you can look for that would indicate, it wouldn't be like a 100% surety that this person is doing X, Y, and Z, but these are indicators, things that you can look for, things that people say, conversations that people are having. And again, I would encourage you to try to attend one of my food defense courses if you can, because we talk about these indicators. And again, it's not just for food defense, it's for active shooters too, and people like that, people that could become an active shooter in the food plant. So the answer is yes, there are things that you can learn, that you can look for, warning signs well in advance to try to offset something that could happen.
Okay, great. And one more, actually, since we have a minute here. There was a question wanting clarification on the food defense segregation as it pertains to the reworks. You talked a little bit a short while ago about separating that. Can you just clarify that for us?
Right. Yeah. Some companies get return product back for whatever reason, damaged goods or whatever. And the simple point is you have to keep that product, return product, separate from new product until you've had a chance to evaluate, whether or not that product is still, good enough, basically. So any return product that you get from a customer, if it's been out of your control, then you really need to evaluate the validity of that product before you mix it back in with your new product. And, you would think that would be a given, but unfortunately, like I said, a couple of times lately, I've seen where companies have brought reworked product back. They'll stage it with new product until they've had a chance to evaluate this reworked product. But see, what happens is that reworked product could potentially end up being shipped out again. And remember, that rework was sent back in the first place because something was wrong with it. So the point is, make sure you keep that separate until you've had a chance to evaluate it.
Yeah, no, you gave some great examples. I think we could do a whole webinar on just some of the crazy stories you have seen.
I think so too.
But I love the idea of bringing you back. This was awesome, and I know everybody really appreciates it. For those questions we didn't get to, we'll make sure again that you have Rod's information. You can also visit him at his website, myfooddefense.com, or give him a call. And we'll also be linking this on our LinkedIn page. So if you haven't connected with us there, we have a LinkedIn page for all of our follow-up on these webinars. We also have some downloads and resources, which we'll be posting this on our website as well. And again, if there's anything on the technology side, we're certainly happy to help. And on the consulting side, we'd certainly love to connect you with Rod for his expertise and training there. So, Rod, thank you again so much. This has been wonderful. Thank you, everybody, for making this a huge success. And we hope you will join us again next month. So thanks a lot, everybody, and we'll see you next time.